Allison Spencer didn't panic at first. The message looked normal. Hey, sorry, just woke up XXX.
Short.
Casual. Exactly the kind of text her daughter sent all the time. Phoenix was 21.
Busy.
Sometimes exhausted after long shifts working in restaurants around East Kilbride. There was nothing alarming about sleeping late on a Sunday morning. Nothing unusual about a delayed reply. So Allison answered the way mothers do. Ordinary conversation. Ordinary affection. Plans for later. Completely unaware that by the time those messages arrived, her daughter had already been dead for hours. Inside a quiet top-floor apartment on Glenlee, the body of Phoenix Spencer Horn lay hidden beneath a towel in the hallway. The heating was still on. The curtains remained closed. And somewhere inside that flat, a man moved calmly between rooms using the phone of the woman he had just killed. For nearly 48 hours, he kept the illusion alive. Not for grief. Not for remorse. For control. The messages continued throughout the weekend. Tiny performances typed with dead fingers in mind. Enough to stop concern. Enough to buy time. To Allison, it still sounded like Phoenix. The kisses at the end of the texts. The relaxed tone. The casual apologies. But something was wrong. Not obvious at first.
Just small things.
Delays. Strange gaps. A feeling difficult to explain. Mothers notice rhythm more than words. And Phoenix had rhythms. She called often. Checked in constantly. She wasn't the type to disappear. Especially not from her mother. Friends later described the two as inseparable. Less like parent and child, more like best friends who spoke every day about everything. Which is why the silence between messages slowly became unbearable. What Allison didn't know was that while she sat staring at her phone waiting for another reply, neighbors inside the apartment block had already started noticing something else. A smell. Faint at first. Easy to dismiss. Then harder to ignore. One neighbor would later describe an odor seeping through the adjoining walls into her kitchen.
Sour.
Heavy.
Wrong.
At the time, she had no reason to imagine that only meters away, behind an ordinary apartment door, a mutilated body had been left lying in darkness for 2 full days. And the man responsible was still there. Still walking around town. Still driving Phoenix's car. Still pretending she was alive. By Sunday afternoon, the deception had become grotesque. Phone records would later reveal repeated activity on Phoenix's device for hours at a time. Internet searches. Messages. Movement. The digital footprint of someone behaving with horrifying normality beside unimaginable violence. The apartment itself remained untouched from the outside. No shattered windows. No signs of forced entry. No screaming heard by the entire building. Just another quiet flat at the top of the stairs hiding something monstrous behind its walls. And then came the call. Monday afternoon. A man contacted emergency services and calmly confessed to murder. Not panic. Not hysteria.
Calm.
Almost detached. The operator listened as the caller claimed he had suffered some kind of psychotic break. He said he blacked out. Said he couldn't fully remember what happened. But there was something chilling about the tone. Because people expecting horror usually sound horrified. This man didn't. As officers drove toward the apartment in East Kilbride, fragments of information started forming an image none of them were prepared for. A dead woman. A boyfriend confessing. Claims of mental collapse. Unknown injuries. Even then, they still could not imagine what waited inside. One officer later admitted the scene would stay with him forever. The door was forced open. The apartment was silent. No television. No movement. Just the thick stillness of death hanging in warm air. Then the smell hit them. Strong now. Undeniable. Officers moved carefully through the flat toward the hallway where something appeared partially concealed beneath fabric.
A towel.
Underneath it was Phoenix Spencer Horn. What detectives discovered in that narrow hallway would shock even experienced investigators.
Blood.
Multiple weapons. Signs of extreme violence. Injuries so severe they transformed a domestic homicide into something far darker and more disturbing. And as the reality of the crime scene unfolded, another horrifying truth emerged alongside it. while Allison Spencer had spent the weekend unknowingly texting her dead daughter. The man responsible had been answering her the entire time.
The officers already knew they were driving toward a murder scene. What they did not know was that the killer was still inside the apartment only hours earlier, walking calmly through the same rooms where unimaginable violence had unfolded. The 999 call had come in just after midday. The man on the line spoke quietly, almost casually. No screaming, no panic, no urgency. He told the operator he believed he had suffered a psychotic break, said he had blacked out after taking steroids, cocaine, and alcohol, said he thought he had killed his girlfriend. Thought, as if uncertainty still existed, as if the horror waiting inside that apartment might somehow be less real once police arrived. By the time officers reached Glenlee and East Kilbride, the atmosphere around the building already felt wrong. Cold air outside, silent windows, ordinary brick walls hiding something catastrophic. Nothing about the apartment itself stood out. No shattered glass, no signs of forced entry, no visible chaos from the street below. Just another quiet top-floor flat where neighbors had unknowingly spent the weekend sleeping beside death. Police climbed the stairs cautiously, and then they smelled it. Not immediately overwhelming, not cinematic. Worse, subtle, heavy. The kind of smell the human brain struggles to identify at first because instinct resists the answer. One officer later described it as air that felt thick enough to taste. The hallway lights inside the building flickered faintly as they approached the apartment door. Every sound suddenly became amplified. Boots against concrete, radio static, breathing, then silence again. Police announced themselves. No response. The door was forced open. The apartment was dark, not blackout dark. Dim, curtains drawn, a sickly half-light filtering through cracks in the fabric. The television wasn't on. No music, no movement, just stillness. The kind of stillness that makes people instinctively lower their voices. Officers entered slowly, scanning room to room. At first glance, parts of the apartment looked disturbingly normal. Cups left out, furniture untouched. Everyday life frozen mid-motion. And then the blood appeared. Small traces at first. Drops near the flooring. Dark smears against surfaces. A trail that seemed to disappear deeper into flat. What struck investigators immediately was not just the amount of blood, but the pattern of it. Violent, chaotic, evidence of movement, struggle, frenzied force. Something catastrophic had happened here. Then one of the officers looked toward the hallway. A towel lay partially draped over something on the floor, too large to ignore. For a moment, nobody moved. Experienced officers understand that there are scenes capable of changing you permanently. Scenes that remain buried somewhere in your mind long after retirement. This was one of them. The towel was pulled back carefully, and the illusion of this being a normal domestic homicide vanished instantly. Phoenix Spencer Horn's body had been mutilated beyond anything officers expected to find inside that apartment. 2 blood-covered knives rested nearby. Another blade would later be discovered elsewhere in the flat. 3 separate knives. That detail mattered, because it suggested duration, escalation, persistence. Not one moment of uncontrolled violence, but repeated decisions. Investigators would eventually determine Phoenix had suffered multiple stab wounds during the attack, some directed toward the most personal areas of the body, others delivered with extraordinary force. But even those injuries were not the most horrifying discovery. There are crime scenes where investigators can immediately sense emotion embedded into violence. Rage, sadism, possession, humiliation. This scene radiated all of them. The mutilation carried a level of overkill so disturbing that even seasoned detectives struggled to process what they were looking at. Officers who had worked violent deaths before would later admit this case stayed with them in ways others never had. Because what happened inside that apartment didn't feel impulsive. It felt personal, intimate, almost ritualistic. And then came the realization that shifted the entire case into something even darker. Phoenix had not been discovered immediately after her death. She had been left there for nearly 2 days, inside the apartment, while the man responsible continued moving freely through the world. That realization changed the emotional gravity of the entire scene. Suddenly, investigators weren't only looking at a brutal homicide, they were looking at behavior afterward, decisions afterward, consciousness afterward. The apartment itself became evidence of psychological contradiction. If this had truly been some uncontrollable psychotic break, why were there signs of concealment? Why cover the body? Why remain in the flat? Why send messages from her phone? Why attempt to preserve the illusion that she was still alive? The more detectives examined the scene, the less the story made sense. Nothing about the apartment reflected panic. There were no signs of someone horrified by what they had done. No desperate attempt to flee immediately. No emotional collapse. Instead, investigators found traces of eerie calmness woven through the aftermath. Delayed reporting, controlled movement, strategic deception. And sitting at the center of all of it was Ewan Methen, 27 years old, a postman, a man described by neighbors as quiet and ordinary, the kind of face nobody remembers twice, which somehow made the apartment even more terrifying. Because the brutality inside that hallway did not belong to the version of Ewan people thought they knew. It belonged to someone else entirely. Or maybe to the person he had been hiding all along. But what disturbed detectives most wasn't only what Ewan Methen did to Phoenix. It was what he did afterward. The hardest part for investigators to understand was how normal Ewan Methen appeared before the murder. Not normal in a performative way violent offenders sometimes present themselves after arrest. Not charming in an obvious, manipulative sense. He wasn't the loud, aggressive type people instinctively distrust. He was quiet, soft-spoken, easy to overlook. The kind of man neighbors barely notice passing through hallways carrying mail bags and grocery bags, blending perfectly into the background of ordinary life. And Phoenix Spencer Horn loved him. At least, that's what the internet seemed to show. Their relationship existed online the way modern relationships often do now. Filtered through smiling photos, affectionate captions, inside jokes, small public declarations that create the appearance of intimacy. Friends remembered TikTok videos. Pictures together, comments filled with hearts and playful teasing. To outsiders, they looked young and inseparable, a couple building a future, a woman deeply in love with a man who appeared gentle and emotionally dependent on her in almost innocent ways. That image would later become one of the most disturbing aspects of the case, because after the murder, people began revisiting old posts with different eyes, and suddenly, tiny details felt wrong. Not obvious red flags. Nothing cinematic. Just subtle emotional patterns hidden beneath affection. The kind people only recognize after tragedy forces them to search backward for answers. Friends described Phoenix as warm, social, and compassionate. The type of person who reassured everyone around her. Someone emotionally generous to a fault. She worked long hours, maintained close family relationships, and constantly checked in on people she cared about. Ewan, by comparison, often appeared emotionally fragile, lonely, needy. Texts recovered later revealed moments where he seemed deeply reliant on Phoenix for stability and reassurance. If she took too long replying, his mood shifted. If she spent time away from him, insecurities surfaced quickly. At first glance, none of it sounded dangerous. In fact, to many people, it sounded familiar. That was the problem. The behavior set inside a category society often romanticizes. Emotional dependence mistaken for devotion. Possessiveness disguised as vulnerability. Neediness interpreted as proof of love. And Phoenix responded the way empathetic people often do, by comforting him, apologizing to him, even when she had done nothing wrong. Investigators would later uncover exchanges where Phoenix soothed Ewan almost like someone managing another person's emotional state. Tiny reassurances, gentle explanations, soft apology for delays that didn't require apology. One message in particular haunted people after the case became public. Phoenix apologizing for falling asleep early, not because she had hurt him, not because she had betrayed him, simply because she worried he felt ignored. That dynamic matters, because coercive control rarely begins with violence. It begins quietly, through guilt, through emotional dependency, through one person slowly becoming responsible for regulating another person's inner world. And from the outside, it can look almost indistinguishable from love. Families trusted Ewan. He attended gatherings, shared meals, spent time around the people closest to Phoenix. Nobody described him as openly dangerous. There were no major criminal convictions lurking in his background, no reputation for brutality, no obvious history screaming future killer, which only deepened the horror later. Because when detectives reconstructed the final days before Phoenix's death, they found no evidence she believed she was in lethal danger. That realization devastated everyone who loved her. She did not spend her last hours trying to escape a monster she clearly recognized. She spent them comforting someone she trusted. And maybe that's the most terrifying aspect of all. The human brain wants violent people to look violent. We want warning signs so obvious they remove uncertainty. We want monsters to announce themselves early enough for victims to run. But the most dangerous individuals often understand that instinct perfectly. So they build camouflage, soft voices, ordinary routines, harmless appearances. Ewan Methan looked like the kind of boyfriend families welcome into their homes. The kind of man people describe as quiet but nice. The kind of face nobody fears standing beside their daughter. And somewhere beneath that ordinary exterior, something darker had already begun growing. Not explosive rage, not chaotic madness. Something colder, a need for emotional possession disguised as love. As detectives later examined the relationship, a disturbing question emerged beneath everything else. Was Phoenix slowly becoming responsible for holding Ewan together emotionally? Because if she was, what would happen the moment he felt he was losing her? The answer may have started revealing itself on the final day of her life. Hours before the murder, Ewan sent messages that carried the same familiar undertone investigators would later recognize throughout the relationship: loneliness, emotional dependence, quiet desperation for reassurance. And Phoenix responded exactly the way she always did. Patiently, kindly, trying to comfort him, trying to make him feel secure. Completely unaware that underneath those ordinary exchanges, something catastrophic was already building inside the man she trusted most. Hours after Phoenix apologized to comfort him, she would be fighting for her life. The final night of Phoenix, Spencer Horne's life began like countless ordinary nights before it. That's what makes cases like this so terrifying. Nothing announces the moment a normal evening crosses into irreversible horror. No soundtrack, no warning, no visible line separating safety from catastrophe. Just small, ordinary moments, quietly moving toward violence. It was Saturday evening in November. Cold outside, dark early. The kind of Scottish night where apartment windows glow softly against wet pavement, and people retreat indoors without realizing tragedy may already be unfolding behind nearby walls. At some point that evening, food was delivered to the apartment. Investigators would later piece together fragments of the timeline through receipts, phone activity, digital records, and witness statements. Tiny traces of routine preserved inside a crime scene that would soon become almost impossible to comprehend. Phoenix was still alive then, still texting, still speaking normally, still believing she was spending another night with someone she trusted. One of the final messages she sent to her mother carried no sign of fear, no coded warning, no indication she sensed danger approaching. That detail devastated investigators later, because hindsight makes people search desperately for hidden clues. A strange phrase, a shift in tone, anything suggesting the victim understood what was coming. But Phoenix didn't. Not yet, which means whatever happened next likely exploded suddenly and violently. Neighbors would later describe hearing sounds from inside the apartment sometime later that night. Not cinematic screaming. Not the kind of noise that instantly makes someone call police. More confusing than that. Raised voices, movement, a disturbance difficult to fully identify through walls. One neighbor remembered hearing what sounded like banging. Another recalled abrupt noise followed by silence. Then nothing. That silence matters. Because in violent domestic attacks, silence often arrives before reality does. The human brain struggles to process strange sounds from nearby apartments. Most people rationalize them away. Arguments happen. Couples fight. Furniture falls over. Nobody wants to believe they're listening to someone dying. Inside the apartment, investigators believe the emotional atmosphere shifted rapidly. Something changed. Maybe a conversation. Maybe perceived rejection. Maybe jealousy. Maybe nothing excellently dramatic at all. That possibility haunted detectives most, because sometimes the trigger for extreme violence exists almost entirely inside the offender's mind. A look, a tone, a fear of abandonment, an imagined humiliation. And once an internal narrative ignites, the victim may not even realize the danger until it's already too late. Evidence later suggested Phoenix fought desperately. Her fitness tracker became one of the most chilling pieces of forensic evidence in the entire case. Data showed a sudden spike in physical activity during the approximate window of the attack, abrupt elevated movement that investigators believed reflected the struggle for her life. It transformed the murder from abstraction into something horrifyingly human. Forensic pathology explains injuries. Digital evidence explains behavior. But biometric data captures panic itself. For a brief period that night, Phoenix's body entered survival mode. Heart racing, movement accelerating, fear flooding the nervous system. Then chaos. Investigators believe the attack began with stabbing. Fast, violent, personal, not a single impulsive strike. Repeated force. The first wounds alone would have caused catastrophic terror inside that apartment. Confined space. Close proximity. No distance between attacker and victim. Every second unfolding face to face. That intimacy matters, because intimate partner homicides are psychologically different from many other killings. The violence often carries emotional symbolism beyond death itself. And this attack escalated far beyond killing. As detectives reconstructed the scene, the injuries suggested rage that kept building even after Phoenix was already defenseless. Multiple stab wounds, again and again, at least 20 in total. Some delivered with extraordinary force, some directed toward her face. That detail deeply disturbed investigators. Facial targeting in violent crimes often carries psychological meaning. Rage toward identity, toward expression, toward the personhood of the victim herself. It can signal dehumanization, possession, punishment, or an inability to tolerate the victim as an individual separate from the offender's emotional control. And still the violence continued escalating. At some point during the attack, strangulation occurred. That detail transformed the psychological profile of the murder entirely, because strangulation is profoundly intimate violence. It requires sustained force, sustained proximity, sustained intention. The killer feels resistance weakening in real time, which means there are moments during strangulation where stopping remains possible. Choices still exist. And yet UN method continued. What happened afterward became almost impossible for detectives to process emotionally, because the murder did not end with death. The violence extended beyond it. Investigators would later determine Phoenix had been decapitated after the attack. Evidence also indicated attempts at dismemberment inside the apartment using multiple knives recovered at the scene. 3 separate blades. Not one uncontrolled moment. Repeated action. Repeated effort. Repeated decisions made over time. That distinction destroyed the defense narrative almost immediately, because Ewan would later claim some kind of blackout, a psychotic episode fueled by substances, fragmented memory, lost control. But the crime scene told a different story. Crime scenes speak through sequence. And this sequence suggested continuation, awareness, persistence. Investigators became haunted by a single question. What was happening psychologically inside that apartment after Phoenix died? Because most killers flee, panic, collapse emotionally, call someone, run for what they've done. Ewan stayed, inside the apartment, beside the body. That detail changed the emotional gravity of the case more than almost anything else. Hours passed after the murder, then more hours. The apartment remained sealed in silence while Phoenix lay in a hallway, and the man responsible moved through nearby rooms. At some point, he covered parts of the scene with towels. At another point, investigators believe he attempted to clean aspects of the aftermath, not successfully, just enough to suggest awareness. Awareness means consciousness. Consciousness means choice. and choice destroys the illusion of uncontrollable madness. Yet even then, detectives still did not fully understand the most disturbing part of the timeline, because the psychological horror of this case wasn't confined to the murder itself. It was what came afterward: the phone activity, the messages, the performative normality, the eerie calmness of a man who had just committed one of the most brutal killings Scotland had seen in years. Somehow, after everything that happened inside that apartment, Ewan Methven still had the presence of mind to pretend Phoenix Spencer Horne was alive, and somehow that wasn't even the most disturbing thing he would do. The apartment should have become unbearable after the murder. That's what investigators expected when they first began reconstructing the 48 hours following Phoenix Spencer Horne's death. Most people cannot remain near catastrophic violence for long. The human nervous system rejects it. Panic sets in. Adrenaline crashes. Reality fractures under the weight of what's been done. Killers flee. They run from blood, from silence, from bodies, from themselves. Ewan Methven did the opposite. He stayed. And that decision transformed an already horrifying murder into something psychologically grotesque. Because every hour he remained inside that apartment forced detectives to confront a deeply disturbing question. What kind of person can coexist calmly beside the aftermath of extreme violence? The answer unfolded slowly through forensic evidence. Phone records, surveillance footage, internet searches, text messages, fragments of behavior that, piece by piece, revealed a man moving through the world with chilling normality, while Phoenix's body decomposed only feet away. The first contradiction emerged through a phone. At first glance, the device suggested Phoenix was still alive after the murder. Messages continued. Notifications were opened. Conversations remained active. But digital forensics doesn't only examine activity. It examines rhythm. And something about the rhythm changed immediately after her death. The language became flatter, shorter, functional. Investigators noticed pauses where responses felt delayed in unnatural ways, as if someone unfamiliar with Phoenix's communication patterns was trying to imitate emotional warmth from memory. To Allison Spencer, those differences only created vague discomfort. To detectives later, they became evidence of impersonation. One of the most haunting aspects of the case is that Ewan didn't simply avoid suspicion. He actively maintained Phoenix's existence, as if deleting her immediately would force him to confront reality too soon. So instead, he extended her digitally, a dead woman continuing conversations through the hands of the man who killed her. The psychology behind that behavior deeply disturbed investigators, because impersonation after murder often reveals something beyond panic. It can reflect control, possession, an inability to emotionally release the victim even after death. And Ewan's behavior over those 2 days only became stranger. Surveillance and digital evidence later showed him leaving the apartment, not fleeing, not disappearing, just continuing. He drove Phoenix's car through town as though nothing catastrophic had happened. Witnesses later described seeing no visible signs of distress, no frantic behavior, no emotional collapse. At one point, he stopped for food. At another, investigators believe he attempted to purchase cocaine. That detail became important later, because Ewan would eventually blame drugs and steroids for the killing itself. Yet his behavior afterward appeared organized enough to seek substances, communicate coherently, and maintain deception over an extended period of time. Again and again, the evidence contradicted his claims of psychological disintegration. And then detectives uncovered the internet activity, the searches, the videos, the pornography, repeatedly viewed while Phoenix's body remained inside the apartment. That revelation sickened even experienced investigators, not simply because of the behavior itself, but because of what it implied emotionally. Compartmentalization, so extreme it almost ceased to feel human. The ability to move between unimaginable violence and ordinary gratification without visible interruption. That psychological contradiction became one of the defining horrors of case, because people instinctively want emotional consistency from monsters. We expect killers to look deranged after murder, haunted, shaking, consumed by guilt or panic. But Ewan Methven appeared disturbingly functional, detached, calm, And that calmness may have been the most frightening thing about him. As detectives mapped his movements hour by hour, the apartment itself began feeling less like a crime scene and more like a sealed psychological chamber, one where reality had split into two parallel worlds. Inside the hallway lay the brutal remains of Phoenix Spencer Horn. Outside the apartment, Ewan continued acting like a person with a future. The contrast was nauseating. Neighbors noticed the smell growing stronger. One woman later described an odor spreading through the walls and into communal spaces. At first, she thought it might be garbage or plumbing problems. But as time passed, the smell became impossible to ignore. And all the while, Ewan remained there, sleeping there, walking past the hallway, using the bathroom, looking at his phone, existing in the same enclosed space as the woman he had mutilated. That level of proximity matters psychologically, because remaining near a victim after death can indicate many things: emotional denial, dissociation, narcissistic possession, or an inability to separate from the object of violence. But Ewan's behavior suggested something even darker: comfort, at least temporarily. The apartment no longer resembled the aftermath of uncontrolled psychosis. It resembled a man delaying consequences. And every action strengthened that impression. He answered messages, moved through public spaces, managed appearances. Even after investigators uncovered evidence of attempted cleaning inside the flat, they found no meaningful attempt to escape Scotland, abandon evidence permanently, or disappear, which raised another terrifying possibility. Did Ewan believe he could somehow explain this away? Or had reality itself become emotionally distant to him? The answer may exist somewhere inside the bizarre emotional contradiction at the center of the case. Because despite the mutilation, despite the blood, despite the prolonged aftermath, he still maintained contact with Phoenix's family. That detail haunted everyone. Imagine the psychological cruelty of it. A mother waking up believing her daughter is alive because a killer sends affectionate replies from her phone. A family unknowingly texting through a mask worn by the man responsible for her death. And behind those messages sat the silent apartment, growing warmer with decomposition. The digital evidence became increasingly difficult for Ewan's later defense to reconcile. Every fake text implied awareness. Every public appearance implied control. Every internet search implied cognition. Every hour beside the body implied acceptance of reality. Not blackout, not psychosis. Continuation. And perhaps the most disturbing aspect of all was how ordinary much of it looked. The world did not stop around him. Cars continued moving through East Kilbride. Restaurants remained open. People laughed in nearby apartments. Phones buzzed. Rain hit pavement outside. And inside that ordinary world, Ewan Methven carried the knowledge of what he had done with horrifying composure. For nearly 2 days, Phoenix Spencer Horn existed simultaneously as a concealed corpse and an active digital presence manipulated by her killer, alive online, dead in reality. That contradiction became the emotional center of the entire case, not only because of the brutality, but because of the deception afterward, because murder alone destroys life. This deception distorted grief itself. It delayed horror, it weaponized hope, and eventually, even Ewan Methven seemed unable to sustain the performance any longer. The smell intensified. The messages became harder to maintain. Reality pressed inward from every side of the apartment. Then finally, after 2 days beside Phoenix's body, Ewan Methven picked up the phone. When Ewan Methven finally called emergency services, Phoenix Spencer Horn had already been dead for nearly 2 days. That detail changes everything about the call, because this was not a panic confession made seconds after violence. It was a performance delivered after 48 hours of silence, deception, internet activity, public movement, and calculated delay, which means every word mattered. The operator answered, and Ewan spoke in a voice so calm it immediately unsettled investigators later reviewing the audio. Not emotional, not hysterical, measured, controlled, as though he had already rehearsed a story in his head long. Before dialing the number, he told the dispatcher he believed he had experienced some kind of psychotic break. That phrase became central to the case. Not, "I murdered my girlfriend." Not, "I lost my temper." A psychotic break. language that immediately frames the speaker as mentally detached from responsibility. Then came the explanation. Steroids, cocaine, alcohol. Ewan claimed he had consumed substances and blacked out during the violence. According to his version of events, his memory fragmented. He suggested he had lost awareness of his actions almost entirely. But the more detectives listened to call, the less convincing it sounded, because genuine psychological collapse often leaves traces in speech, disorientation, confusion, emotional instability, incoherent thinking. Ewan sounded disturbingly composed. At one point, he reportedly told the operator something close to, "I just want to go to jail." The sentence should sound remorseful. Instead, investigators later described it as strangely performative, almost cinematic. The kind of thing someone says when imagining how guilt is supposed to sound. That distinction became important, because throughout the investigation, detectives noticed a recurring contradiction between Ewan's words and his behavior. He claimed chaos. The evidence showed organization. He claimed blackout. The evidence showed prolonged awareness. He claimed psychological collapse. The evidence showed continuation. Even small details inside the 999 call raised questions. There was no frantic urgency to save Phoenix. No desperate attempt at medical intervention. No repeated checking on her condition. By the time Ewan called emergency services, he already knew she was beyond saving, because he had known for 2 days. And somewhere underneath the calmness of the call sat another unsettling possibility. Maybe he wasn't confessing because guilt overwhelmed him. Maybe he was confessing because maintaining the illusion had finally become impossible. As investigators continued examining the timeline, Ewan's explanation began collapsing under the weight of forensic contradiction. The delivery driver who visited the apartment the night of the murder later described Ewan as appearing sober and coherent, not psychotic, not visibly detached from reality. Nothing about the interaction suggested someone spiraling into uncontrollable mental collapse. That testimony mattered enormously because it challenged the entire foundation of Ewan's defense narrative, and the digital evidence only deepened the contradiction. During the supposed blackout period, Ewan used Phoenix's phone, responded to messages, searched online content, attempted to obtain drugs, drove through public spaces, and maintained deception for nearly 48 hours. Those are not random actions. They require sequencing, decision-making, adaptation, awareness of consequences. Psychosis can distort reality. Substance abuse can lower inhibition. Violent outbursts can happen under intoxication. But detectives struggled to reconcile genuine psychological detachment with the sustained manipulation that followed the murder, especially the texting. Because impersonating Phoenix required something deeply specific, the ability to understand other people still believed she was alive. That means Ewan understood reality well enough to manipulate it, and manipulation requires consciousness. The more investigators studied the call, the colder it began to feel, not because Ewan sounded overtly evil, because he didn't. That was the unsettling part. He sounded ordinary, almost tired, like a man discussing consequences already accepted internally. And hidden inside that emotional flatness was a horrifying absence, the absence of visible grief for Phoenix herself. The woman he claimed to love had been mutilated inside their apartment. Yet during the call, investigators heard very little emotional focus on her suffering. The center of the conversation remained Ewan, his blackout, his mental state, his confusion, his guilt, his desire for punishment. Phoenix existed almost like a secondary figure in the narrative of her own murder. That psychological shift deeply disturbed criminal behavior analysts later examining the case, because extreme offenders often reposition themselves emotionally at the center of tragedy, even after committing horrific violence. And Ewan's language seemed to reflect exactly that, not emotional devastation over losing Phoenix, emotional management of himself. By the time detectives finished reconstructing the timeline, very few believed the murder had occurred inside some unknowable psychological void. The evidence painted something far more chilling. A man who may have lost emotional control temporarily during the attack, but regained functional awareness long before he ever picked up the phone. Investigators didn't believe he blacked out. In fact, the evidence suggested the exact opposite. By the time investigators finished reconstructing the timeline, the case no longer resembled a sudden explosion of random violence. It resembled psychological possession. That distinction matters, because there's a comforting myth people tell themselves after crimes like this. The myth says monsters are easy to identify, that they exist separately from ordinary men, that violence this extreme must come from obvious madness. But criminal psychologists studying intimate partner homicide often encounter something far more unsettling. Men who appear emotionally dependent long before they become violent. Not dominant at first glance. Not openly terrifying. Fragile. Needy. Quietly consuming. And that pattern began surfacing everywhere in Ewan Methin's relationship with Phoenix Spencer Horn. The deeper detectives looked, the more they noticed a specific emotional structure underneath the relationship, one built around dependency disguised as vulnerability. Ewan rarely appeared controlling in overt ways. He didn't need to. Control can emerge through guilt just as effectively as aggression. A sigh after delayed replies. Loneliness framed as abandonment. Emotional sadness positioned as the partner's responsibility to fix. Tiny invisible pressures repeated over time until one person slowly becomes emotionally trapped inside the role of caretaker. Phoenix appears to have stepped naturally into that role, comforting him, reassuring him, softening his insecurities, trying to stabilize his emotions. And people who weaponize vulnerability often rely on exactly that kind of empathy, because the manipulation doesn't feel like manipulation at first. It feels like love. That psychological dynamic may explain why investigators found so little evidence Phoenix believed she was in imminent danger. The threat wasn't constantly visible. It hid inside emotional dependency, inside subtle possessiveness, inside the quiet expectation that Phoenix's attention existed primarily to regulate Ewan's emotional world. And relationships built on emotional possession become extraordinarily dangerous once independence enters the equation. Experts in coercive control often describe a phenomenon where the controlling partner experiences emotional separation not as disappointment, but as annihilation. A delayed response becomes rejection. A boundary becomes betrayal. Autonomy becomes abandonment. And if the offender's identity depends heavily on maintaining emotional ownership over a partner, perceived loss can trigger catastrophic rage. That possibility became impossible to ignore once detectives analyzed the nature of the violence itself. Because this wasn't merely homicide. It was overkill. Overkill is a term investigators use when violence exceeds what's necessary to cause death. Multiple wounds. Escalation after incapacitation. Continued assault beyond survival. Psychologically, overkill often signals emotional meaning embedded inside the attack. Not simply a desire to end life. A desire to destroy, to punish, to erase. The injuries to Phoenix's face became especially significant in that analysis. Violence directed toward the face is deeply personal. Human identity lives there. Expression lives there. Recognition lives there. Criminal profilers sometimes associate facial targeting with rage toward the victim as a person rather than merely an obstacle. And in intimate partner killings, it can reflect resentment toward independence itself, toward the victim existing outside the offender's emotional control. That possibility cast the murder in horrifying light, because if Ewan viewed Phoenix less as a separate individual and more as an emotional extension of himself, then losing her autonomy may have felt psychologically intolerable. And then came the behavior after death, the text, the impersonation, the continuation of her digital life. This may have been the most psychologically revealing aspect of the entire case. Most people think possession ends with death. In some offenders, it intensifies. The fake messages to Alice and Spencer weren't only deception designed to delay discovery. They also allowed Ewan to continue controlling Phoenix's existence, socially even after killing her physically. He became the gatekeeper of her voice, the author of her final conversations. For 2 days, he decided who could emotionally reach her and what they would hear in return. That level of control disturbed investigators profoundly, because psychologically, it suggested the relationship had transformed into ownership. And ownership doesn't end easily, especially for individuals whose emotional identity depends on domination hidden beneath dependency. The apartment itself almost became symbolic of that distorted psychology. A sealed environment where Ewan maintained proximity to Phoenix after death instead of separating from the reality of what he had done. Why stay? That question haunted the investigation. Some experts believe offenders who remain near victims after intimate violence may experience conflicting psychological states simultaneously. Panic, grief, possession, denial, control, self-pity. Human psychology does not always separate cleanly into categories like evil or insane. Sometimes offenders experience emotional attachment and extreme violence simultaneously, and that contradiction may explain why Ewan's behavior felt so incomprehensible, because the evidence suggested he was not emotionally detached in the robotic sense. He was emotionally distorted, focused inward, consumed by himself. Even his remorse appeared centered around his own collapse rather than Phoenix's suffering. That narcissistic inward focus surfaced repeatedly across the investigation. In the 999 call, in the blackout claims, in the substance explanations, in the performative statements about prison. Everything bent back toward Ewan's emotional experience. Phoenix herself slowly disappeared beneath the narrative he built around the murder. And perhaps that was always the hidden danger. Not pure hatred, not psychotic chaos. Possession so deep it erased the victim's humanity entirely. By this point in the investigation, detectives no longer believed they were looking at a man who simply snapped without warning. They believed they were seeing the final eruption of psychological patterns that had likely existed long before the murder ever occurred. Quiet entitlement, dependency, fear of abandonment, emotional control, disguised as love. And then came one detail that deeply unsettled investigators analyzing Ewan's mindset during those 48 hours beside the body. Because at one point, after everything he had done, after the mutilation, after the fake texts, after the prolonged deception, after living beside Phoenix's body for nearly 2 days, Ewan Methen reportedly made a statement that revealed something chilling. Not confusion, not fragmentation, memory, awareness. The kind of awareness impossible to reconcile with genuine blackout. And then came the statement that convinced detectives he remembered everything. By the time Ewan Methen entered court, the details of what happened inside the apartment had already horrified Scotland. But courtrooms transform horror into something colder, measured, documented, permanent. There are no dramatic soundtracks in real courtrooms, no cinematic lighting, just fluorescent silence, grieving families, and the unbearable process of hearing human cruelty translated into legal language. Murder becomes evidence. Love becomes timelines. A daughter becomes forensic detail. And somewhere inside that machinery, families are forced to sit still while strangers describe the worst moments of their lives aloud. Ewan eventually pleaded guilty to murdering Phoenix Spencer Horn. The plea removed the possibility of a trial, but it did not spare Phoenix's family from the devastation waiting inside the courtroom. Because guilty pleas do not erase images. They do not erase timelines. And they certainly do not erase the knowledge of what happened after the killing. As prosecutors outlined the sequence of events, the emotional gravity inside the courtroom reportedly became overwhelming. Detectives described the attack, the mutilation, the deception, the fake messages sent from Phoenix's phone after her death. That detail shattered people, not only because of its cruelty, but because it forced Phoenix's mother to relive those final conversations with horrifying new understanding. Every reassuring message, every casual reply, every moment hope briefly survived. None of it came from Phoenix. For nearly 2 days, Allison Spencer had unknowingly been speaking to the man who murdered her daughter. That psychological cruelty hung heavily over the sentencing. And then came the photographs, the evidence, the details too disturbing for many people in the courtroom to fully process. At one point, descriptions of the injuries reportedly left people visibly shaken. Some wept openly. Others stared downward in silence, because the violence itself carried emotional meaning impossible to ignore. This wasn't detached killing. It was intimate destruction. The judge recognized that immediately. During sentencing, Ewan Methen was described in terms rarely used lightly inside criminal courts. The brutality of the attack, the treatment of Phoenix afterward, and the prolonged deception pushed the case beyond ordinary homicide in the eyes of many observers. One phrase echoed across headlines afterward: personification of evil. The words felt severe. But for Phoenix's family, language itself had already begun failing. How do you adequately describe a man who murders someone he claims to love, then spends 2 days pretending she's still alive? How do you process the fact that your daughter died violently while her killer calmly answered your messages from her phone? There is no vocabulary large enough for that kind of grief. And grief inside courtrooms becomes strangely fragmented. Part rage, part numbness, part surreal disbelief. Families sit only meters away from the person responsible, often searching unconsciously for humanity still remaining in their face. Some sign of collapse, some visible burden of guilt. But people watching Ewan during proceedings often described emotional flatness instead. Detachment. At one point, reports emerged that he made comments about prison in a tone that many interpreted as disturbingly casual given the scale of devastation surrounding him. That emotional disconnect only intensified public fury, because by then, the case had evolved beyond murder in the public imagination. It became symbolic of something larger: the hidden danger of coercive control, the terror of intimate violence, the horrifying reality that monsters often look ordinary until it's too late. When the sentence finally came, Ewan Methen received life imprisonment with a minimum term of 23 years before parole eligibility. 23 years. The number landed heavily inside the courtroom, and yet for many people, it still felt impossibly small compared to the enormity of what had been taken. Phoenix lost her future. Her family lost birthdays, conversations, holidays, grandchildren, ordinary moments that now existed only in imagination. No sentence can restore those things. No prison term can return the final goodbye her mother never got to have. That may be the cruelest part of murders involving sudden intimate violence. There is no preparation. One day someone exists fully inside your life. The next day they become memory, evidence, and photographs. And afterward, families spend years replaying ordinary moments, searching desperately for warning signs that never seemed obvious enough at the time. The courtroom eventually emptied. Reporters left. The legal process moved forward. Ewan disappeared into the prison system. But the emotional aftermath of the case did not end there, because Phoenix Spencer Horn became more than a victim inside a courtroom. She became a reminder of how easily emotional control can hide beneath the appearance of love, a reminder that violence often grows quietly before it explodes publicly, and a reminder that some of the most dangerous people in the world never appear monstrous until the moment they finally reveal what they truly are. But Phoenix's story would not end in that courtroom. The flowers began arriving before sunrise. White lilies, handwritten cards, tiny stuffed Phoenix toys left beside candles that flickered against cold pavement outside the apartment building where detectives had spent days pulling horror out of silence. By then, the story had already spread far beyond that street. People across the country knew the photographs: the smiling mother, the little girl with bright eyes and missing front teeth, the boyfriend who looked painfully ordinary, soft-spoken, calm, forgettable. That was the part people couldn't stop thinking about. Not the blood, not the crime scene. Him, because monsters are easier to survive when they look like monsters. What terrified people about Phoenix's case was how completely human evil had looked standing in that apartment kitchen, answering questions politely while a child lay dead only feet away. And even after everything he had done, the manipulation didn't stop. It continued through text messages, through lies, through performance, through a mother desperately clinging to hope while unknowingly speaking to the man who had already stolen her daughter's life. In the days after the investigation ended, donations began pouring into funeral fundraisers from strangers who had never met Phoenix. Some sent $5. Some sent hundreds. Many attached messages that investigators would later say were difficult to read without breaking down. I held my daughter tighter tonight. She deserved better. I can't stop thinking about her. Neither could the detectives. Several officers involved in the case admitted privately that Phoenix's murder stayed with them in ways other investigations hadn't. Not because violence was unfamiliar, They had seen violence before. It was the emotional cruelty surrounding this case that lingered. The waiting, the deception, the unbearable timeline. A mother believing her child was alive, while the killer calmly replied to her messages in real time. That detail haunted people, because everyone imagined themselves in Allison's position. Everyone imagined sending those texts. Is she okay? Tell her I love her. Please answer me. And somewhere inside that apartment, the truth had already gone silent. As the funeral arrangements began, community groups started organizing memorial donations in Phoenix's name. Local advocates for domestic violence awareness quickly recognized something deeply important about the case. The warning signs had existed, not dramatic ones, not movie-style threats. Smaller things. Control disguised as concern. Isolation disguised as love. Manipulation disguised as protection. The kind of behaviors people often dismiss because they don't look dangerous yet. That became one of the most painful conversations surrounding Phoenix's death. How many victims never realize they're living beside escalation until escalation becomes irreversible? Experts who later discussed the case pointed to a chilling pattern common in abusive personalities. The need for control becomes stronger when abandonment feels imminent. And according to investigators, that fear had been building inside him long before the murder. The relationship had deteriorated. Tension had grown. Cracks had widened beneath the surface. To outsiders, it still looked reparable. To him, losing control may have felt intolerable. That's what made the case so psychologically disturbing. There was no masked intruder, no criminal mastermind hiding in shadows. Just a man sitting on a couch answering text messages while pretending everything was normal. A man who understood exactly how trust works and exactly how to weaponize it. The symbolism of Phoenix's name began affecting people too. Phoenix, a name associated with rebirth, survival, rising from destruction. At the memorial service, mourners reportedly spoke less about how she died and more about who she had been before violence entered her life. Energetic, funny, curious, a little girl who loved attention and laughter and being around people she trusted. That mattered, because true crime has a way of reducing victims to their final moments. This case resisted that. People wanted the world to remember her as a child first. Not evidence, not headlines, not tragedy, just Phoenix. For Allison Spencer, grief unfolded in layers investigators knew would likely never fully heal. First came panic, then confusion, then disbelief, then the crushing realization that every hopeful message she had received had been part of an illusion carefully maintained by someone she had once trusted enough to allow near her daughter. Psychologists sometimes describe traumatic betrayal as a unique kind of wound because it attacks the victim's sense of reality itself. Not only does trust collapse, memory becomes poison too. Conversations replayed differently. Smiles change meaning. Ordinary moments become unbearable to revisit because hidden beneath them was information the victim never knew. That was the psychological devastation left behind in this case. Not just murder. Deception layered on top of intimacy. And perhaps that is why the story spread with such force online. People weren't only reacting to violence. They were reacting to recognition. Recognition of how easily danger can hide inside familiarity. How evil rarely introduces itself honestly. How sometimes the most dangerous person in a child's life is the person everyone stopped worrying about because they seemed normal enough. The ordinary monster theme returned again and again in public conversations after the case closed. Neighbors described him as quiet, polite, nothing alarming. No screaming fights spilling into streets. No dramatic warning sirens. Just normalcy. That word became chilling afterward. Normal. Because hindsight transforms ordinary details into unbearable clues. The unanswered text. The delayed response. The shifting explanations. The subtle controlling behavior people dismissed at the time. After the murder, domestic violence organizations reported renewed conversations online about emotional abuse and coercive control, forms of abuse many victims struggle to identify, because they often arrive without bruises at first. That became part of Phoenix's legacy too. Awareness. Painful awareness. The understanding that violence often begins quietly, slowly, psychologically. long before it becomes physical, long before police tape, long before memorial candles appear outside apartment buildings. For many viewers following the case, one question continued echoing long after the headlines faded. Could this have been prevented? It's a question true crime leaves behind more than any other. The impossible question. The one people ask because randomness feels too terrifying to accept. Investigators never found an answer comforting enough to erase what happened because cases like this are built from tiny moments that seem harmless individually until they suddenly connect into catastrophe. A controlling comment, an apology, a manipulation, a threat disguised as vulnerability, a cycle repeating quietly behind closed doors. Then one day, someone disappears. And afterward, everyone searches backward through memory, try to locate the exact moment danger became deadly. But real life rarely provides that clarity. That uncertainty is part of what makes these stories linger. Phoenix's case did not end cleanly. It ended heavily, like a door closing in slow motion. The apartment eventually emptied. The crime scene tape disappeared. The news cameras left. But for the people connected to the case, silence never fully returned. Because once you understand what happened inside that apartment, ordinary things begin to feel different. Delayed text messages, unanswered calls, sudden changes in tone. Trust itself becomes fragile. And maybe that is the most haunting truth buried underneath this story. Not that evil exists. People already know that. It's that evil can look patient, gentle, helpful. It can sit beside you for years learning exactly how to sound trustworthy before revealing what it truly is. That realization followed this case everywhere, into discussions, into interviews, into the minds of parents staring a little longer at their sleeping children at night. And in the end, Phoenix became more than a victim in a headline. Her story became a warning about hidden violence, about coercion, about manipulation disguised as love, about the terrifying reality that some predators do not hunt from dark alleys. They build relationships first, then they hide inside them, long after the investigation ended. One image continued haunting people more than any crime scene photograph ever could. A mother staring at her phone, waiting for replies, feeling relief each time a message arrived, never realizing she was speaking to a man who had already taken her daughter away forever. For Allison Spencer, the most horrifying part was never the blood inside that apartment. It was the messages she answered, believing her daughter was still alive.